Hello, I'm Helen Edwards from the Foundation Stage Forum. I'm joined by my colleague Jules Mickleborough. Julian, as we all know, has been leading on the new non-statutory guidance, Development Matters, for the Department for Education. Today we're going to be listening to their presentations, and then we have quite a number of questions which have been posed by our Facebook group, which comprises 17,000 members. Now, they'll be relieved to hear that we haven't got 17,000 questions. We did have 50 or 60, and we've grouped them because many of them, as you'd expect, were quite similar. So we'll come to the questions a bit later, but we're going to hear from Julian first for a short 10-15 minute presentation. Over to you, Julian.
Great, lovely. Thank you, Helen. And it's great to be at this event that Foundation Stage Forum is hosting. And I guess just before we kind of kick into the presentation, it's just to say that a massive tribute really to everyone in the early years who's working so hard at the moment for children and families. And, you know, we're probably experiencing many of the same stresses and struggles as everyone else out there here at Sheringham Nursery School, trying to make sure our earliest provision is safe and wonderful for the children and families, with so much else that's going on. And we must begin with that daily reality and importance of what everyone out there is doing. And I take my hat off to all of the whole of the early years sector for everything that's happening. So I'm going to talk us a little through a few of the kind of headlines of the updated Development Matters. So if we start the PowerPoint, I think the first important thing to say about Development Matters is that this doesn't replace the current version of Development Matters until September 2021. And this is really a period now for the sector to become familiar with the new document. But I wouldn't suggest that anyone makes any significant changes to what they are doing at the moment. We've all got plenty on our minds without doing that. So let's take this in a measured way over the next 11 months, become familiar with the guidance and think through what it means for us. Now, if you're an early adopter school, then you are in a slightly different position. And it's great to see that Foundation Stage Forum is going to be offering some specific support for the early adopters. But for the rest of the sector, I would say use the time to think and consider and make sense of the new guidance, and don't start making any big changes quickly. So if we kind of start by thinking about the big picture of early years here, which is my second slide. So if we begin by thinking about the big picture is what sort of experiences do we want our children to have in the early years? What is it that we want them to be able to do? What do we want them to learn? That's really what this is all about. Development Matters is not that curriculum. So the responsibility for that curriculum sits exactly where it ought to, which is with the settings, the childminders, the early years teachers in schools and their practitioners. They're the right people to make the decisions about the curriculum that's right for their children, that's right for the local community, and is also ambitious. Development Matters sits in the background as guidance to help people think about some of the typical sequences of children's learning and development. And it also gives some suggestions of the ways that adults can help. But I think where we go wrong with this is if we think Development Matters is the curriculum and we've got to cover all of these things, and we then start putting this huge focus on coverage, which I'll talk about a bit in a moment. But there's one other important thing which I think is relevant at the moment, which is the curriculum has to be flexible. So I'm looking at the kids coming into Sheringham Nursery School for the first time, our new starters, and I'm also spending time and talking about our returners. And we've got to make sure that we adapt what we're doing to meet the needs of those children now. So in other words, the curriculum we offer isn't some static and fixed thing. It has to be adapted and it has to be right for the children at different times. So I'm expecting we're going to be putting a lot more focus, certainly in the months ahead, on children's physical development and also supporting their PSED and supporting their communication and language, because that's what the children need who've been in difficult circumstances, locked down for a period of time. So earlier I talked a bit about the question of development matters not being the curriculum and coverage and progress. So the danger we have is that if we're very focused on children moving from one band to the next, we get very fixed on covering lots and lots of new things, but that is not the way that the best practice in early years works. The best practice in early years is about checking that children are secure, that they've had plenty of time to learn and experience things in different contexts, that they're confident, that they've practiced things over and over again, and it's only then that we start to think about where the next step for their progress should be. So this is not all about moving children from one band to the next. It's about thinking about the big picture of what we want children to learn in our settings, and then thinking really carefully about how do we check that they're secure? Have they had enough time to really practice and repeat things? Have they done things in different contexts? So I think just to give a kind of maybe rather basic example, when I think of the small toddlers who would in normal times be in our children's centre stay and play, many of them have never used a wheeled toy before. So there's a lot of getting on and off those wooden push along four-wheel toys that we've got, which are so lovely for them. And we're not kind of thinking, gosh, this child needs to kind of move on to a tricycle. We know they need a lot of time to explore and to get confident and to repeat stuff. And as they move into our 2-year-old provision, then they often do encounter a tricycle for the first time. And again, there's a lot of new stuff to learn there. So balancing on the seat, steering, pedaling. Then when you can do those things individually, you have to work out how you combine them all together. So like lots of early years practitioners, my shins are appallingly bruised by the numbers of children that have kind of belted into me on wheeled toys. And again, that takes a lot of time. And as children move into our 3 and 4 provision, and we're seeing them really confident and fluent using trikes, then we move them onto 2-wheel bikes. So we've got that progression model, but we're always checking that children have had plenty of time with the phase they're in at the moment before we think about the next step. And we've got a big picture in our setting around wheeled toys, if you like, that moves from those 4-wheel push-alongs to the 3-wheel trike, to the 2-wheel balance bike, to the pedal bike without stabilizers. And we're ambitious. We want all our children to be on a 2-wheel bike by the time they end nursery. But we know that we've got to take it at the pace of the children, and we've got to make sure they're secure where they are before we start introducing something new to them. You don't want to be given a 2-wheel bike if you're not yet riding a trike confidently. But the other thing I'd say about curriculum is that it's important to have that big picture, but it's also important in the early years to think about being flexible and also being sensible around it. So we know that children come in with sudden new interests and excitements, and it's important to capitalize on that. Motivation, children pursuing their fascinations are a very, very significant part of early years. So we're constantly having to keep that careful balance between, on the one hand, there are things we really want children to experience and to know, but on the other hand, the children's own motivation and fascinations are important. And that's why early years is such a great phase to be working in, because it's about that balancing act. The final bit I'd like to focus on here, to move the slide on, is around trust and professionalism. So there is a lot less content in the new development matters than there was in the previous version. It's about 2/3 of the length. And that is an opportunity for our sector, which is to say that we don't need the level of guidance and prescription that perhaps has traditionally been in the system. We can trust our early years practitioners, our teachers, to make the right decisions for the children they're working with without having to follow an enormous amount of guidance that's broken down into small steps. And one of the key issues here really is about professional development for our staff teams. What's really going to change things for children isn't document A or document B. It's the professional development of our teams, and then the way that our teams work together and meet the needs and also engage with the strengths and the fascinations of the children that we're working with. So I'm not making any apology for the fact that we, in this document, we're reducing the amount of content and prescription, and we're putting more trust in the early years teams around the country and the childminders around the country. But the implication of that is that we need to put a great focus on staff professional development. And in time, I think there are also some tricky questions we need to address around the quality of initial qualifications across the sector. So the next message I'd really like to focus on is about the question of progression. So, of course, it really matters that we help children to make progress, but the model for that progress is the curriculum we've designed for the children we're working with. Go back to that example about the trikes and the bikes, for example. So if we know that children are doing well using that model with the resources we're offering them and all of that adult interaction and support, we don't need a huge amount of data or tracking or assessment. Those children are doing well. We can celebrate how well they're doing. We can celebrate that with their parents. And that then frees up a lot of time for us to think about the children that are struggling, the children that we need to spend more significant amounts of time observing, getting to know, trying to understand the child's strengths, but also the barriers to their learning, forging that partnership with the parents, maybe making links to outside agencies. So one of the key points in the guidance is, before you start doing lots of work around assessment, think about why you're doing it, what the purpose is, and how useful it's going to be. I think that for a lot of children, the real purpose of what we should be doing and what we can use Tapestry for example, is to find those examples where children are learning something that is really significant for them, that's sustained over time, and shows how the child is really becoming a more powerful learner. So those lovely vignettes, those lovely little examples that you can share with parents about how a child returned to something over a period of a few days and really persevered and really got somewhere with their learning, thinking about children becoming more powerful learners, using communication more as they learn, talking and thinking, looking back over what they've learned previously as they become stronger learners. So those are the sorts of things that I think are really valuable to use Tapestry for. And we know that having those things to both reflect on with parents, but also for children to look back on, is really helpful to build the partnership with parents, but also to help children reflect on their own progress and development as learners. So one of the sound bites, I guess, that I'm trying to share with a lot of people here as we look at the new developments is checkpoints, not checklists, which is the next slide. So, do we need lots of checklists for all of the children we're working with to make sure that they're doing well? No. What we need is the right curriculum and the highly skilled staff working with the children. And the progress model is through the curriculum and through the way that the staff work with those children. So there are checkpoints in the new development matters, and they're in place in the prime areas really to help staff who may be less experienced or maybe in a school, for example, someone who's new to EYFS, just to see some of the key things that we might expect children to be doing at certain stages in their development. So they're there to guide. They're not there to be turned into a checklist and used for all children. And staff who are more experienced in the early years are going to need them much less than newer or less experienced staff. What we also certainly need to have in the early years are systems to make sure that no groups of children are missing out. So if you've got large numbers of disadvantaged children on roll funded by the offer for 2-year-olds or eligible for early years pupil premium, then of course it's really vital that you've got systems in place to make sure that those children are getting the sort of provision they need and are making strong progress like everyone else is. If you're in a setting where you're counting those children on the fingers of one hand, that sort of system isn't going to be sensible. It's really just going to be looking at each child as an individual and thinking through the sort of support that's being offered to them. But the main point I would put to everyone here is what we haven't yet done well in the system in England is to make sure that all children are doing really well in their early years, and the gaps between disadvantaged children and everyone else are still a matter of concern. And that's something that we do definitely need to keep an eye on. But the alternative to this approach is that we end up with enormous amounts of data on children, which aren't really useful for us as practitioners. They don't really mean anything to parents when you share them with parents. They tie up an enormous amount of our time, which we could spend doing other things which are more valuable. So it's an awful lot of work for not a lot of outcomes for the children. And that, I think, is where we are hoping that the new development matters will give managers and teams and childminders and school leaders the opportunity over the year ahead just to rethink the balance of what we're doing and make sure that we're putting our efforts where they really need to be. And that really takes me on to my final slide here. And that is about moral purpose. So I'm always meeting people working in the early years, and they're here because they really passionately want to make a difference for children. I don't know anyone who said, I trained to be an early years educator because I like to generate a lot of data on a spreadsheet and analyze it. But I do meet people who are incredibly passionate about their work. And I think we've got an opportunity now to put a lot more trust in our workforce and to say to the sector, let's put our efforts where they're going to make a difference, which is in the direct work with the children. It's the playing, it's the conversations, it's helping children to learn to do something new. It's the respectful partnership with the parents. That's where the difference happens. And we've got to make space and time to put our efforts there. And we've got to stop doing things which are both very time consuming, but also very unlikely to result in anything positively happening for a child. Why are we in the job? You know, we're here because we want to do the very, very best for children. We want to inspire children. We want to give them the skills in their physical development and communication. We want to give them the confidence and the self-belief that they're going to do really, really well as learners through the school system. That's why we're all here. So we've got to take the emphasis away from where it isn't productive and really focus on what will make a difference for children.